Chapter 4, Storm Befalls. Storms always beget great pain. At least for Keiya, that had always been the case. The first had been that stormy night that his father abandoned him in the foreign and strange land of Mondstadt. A child was all he had been, yet in his homeland's eyes, he was a tool for war. A seed of chaos planted in the territory of the enemy, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to sprout. He would always carry the memory of that fateful night. How he was left to fend for himself by his own flesh and blood, only to be saved by a kind soul who only saw innocence in Keiya's eyes. The young boy had believed the man to be naive and foolish to let a stranger into his home without hesitation, but it was that naivete that gave Keiya new hope. A new family. Master Krepa's kindness opened Keiya up to a world that he'd never experienced before. In the young Diluc, he'd found a brother, a friend like no other. In Krepas he found a father that loved and cared for him. And in Mondstadt, he found a home with people who saw him as a person instead of a tool. But with all good things, it's only a matter of time before they come crashing down. Until this day, Keiya had never failed in his duty. He always completed his task, always arrived on time to save the day. But today was different. Today he had been too late. Today he failed. He should have seen it coming when the dark clouds began to roll in from the horizon. He should have moved faster once he tasted the scent of rain on the wind. Yet when he saw Master Krepas, the father that had shown him what love between parent and son truly was, dead in his biological son's arms, Keiya froze, a battle between conflictions raging in his mind. Even as the sky cried in mourning for the soul lost that day, Keiya continued to fight with himself and his emotions. At his core, he was a son of Canra, and that is where his ultimate duty should have lied. Yet in Mondstadt, he'd experienced something that he'd never once thought possible. Happiness. Love. What was more important to him, loyalty, or happiness? No matter how hard he searched for the right answer, it continued to elude him. The torrential downpour continued well into the night, and as Keiya walked the streets of Mondstadt, he paid little attention to the rain soaking him down to the bone. Everything that had happened still didn't feel real, and a part of him hoped that maybe it was all a dream. Maybe when he returned home, he would be welcomed back with open arms by Master Krepas. If only dreams really did exist. There was one thing that continued to eat away at him more than anything else. Diluc. Keiya had never had a brother before, and he truly believed that he would never find a better one than Diluc. As Diluc rose to be the star of the Knights of Favonius, Keiya had always been by his side, supporting him through thick and thin. Some thought that maybe Keiya was jealous of his prodigious brother, but it was quite the opposite. He was content staying in his brother's shadow. But now that Star's light was fading, and Keiya wasn't there to help him like he should have been. The one time that Diluc needed him the most, Keiya was wasting away in the rain, selfishly thinking about the conflicts in his heart. There was no pain in the world that Keiya could feel that would be worse than what Diluc was going through. Keiya had lost his own biological father when he was abandoned, but he'd never lost a biological father that loved him unconditionally. That was Diluc's burden to bear. But he shouldn't have had to bear it alone. No matter how hard Keiya tried to push the feelings out of his heart, guilt continued to gnaw at his soul. He couldn't go on like this. He couldn't keep hiding himself from Diluc any longer. Not after what happened to Master Krepas. If there was anybody that deserved the whole truth, it was Diluc. That is how Keiya found himself back at the Dawn Winery mansion, water dripping from his dark blue hair and clothing. The eye patch over his right eye clung to his skin in an uncomfortable manner, but he didn't dare take it off or move it. There were only so many secrets he was willing to divulge in one night, and that was not one of them. Even though he still considered this place his home, Keiya felt like an outsider, rather than walk in. He knocked on the door, hoping that someone would let him in. He waited and waited, yet no answer came. All was silent other than the patter of the rain, and if Kaia wasn't certain that Diluc was home, he would have believed the place to be empty. He knocked again, but this time he heard movement from the other side of the door. It was faint, but he could hear the footsteps on the pristine wooden floors as someone approached the door. They stopped right in front of the door, and Kaia could sense the hesitation. He almost thought they would walk away, but after a moment of brief stillness, the door finally opened. Kaia felt both relief and gut-wrenching anxiety when it was Diluc that answered the door. His brother looked far worse than Kaia would have imagined, and the guilt only piled on higher. Once shining red eyes full of vigor were now dull rubies. Diluc had always carried himself with pride, yet now he looked a shell of his former self. The two brothers stared at each other in silence. Kaia wasn't sure how long they stood there, but it was Diluc that finally spoke the first word. "Well? It's pouring out there. Come inside." His voice was hoarse and hollow, void of emotion. Even with the invitation, Kaia stayed put. He wanted to say something, but his words got caught in his throat. Unable to speak, Kaia's gaze dropped to the ground in shame, and he shook his head. Diluc breathed in heavily, almost as if he were trying to keep himself from exploding. Through clenched teeth he said, "You've been avoiding me all day, and even when you finally show up, you still avoid me? What game are you playing, Kaia?" Kaia raised his eyes to look at his brother, and it took all his strength to not flinch away from the flames in Diluc's eyes. "I'm not avoiding you, Diluc. I've simply needed some time to think things through." Met with silence, Kaia took a deep breath to try and steady his rapidly beating heart. He couldn't keep hiding any longer. It was time. "Diluc. The night that Master Crepus found me, I hadn't been separated from my father in the storm." That was a lie. At first there was confusion in Diluc's eyes at the sudden declaration, but it slowly faded to hardened interest. When he said nothing, Kaia continued his confession. "My father knowingly brought me here to Mondstadt, but not for an adventure like I always said." Kaia paused to swallow the lump that had begun to form in his throat before he finally let loose the secret he had held onto for so long. "He brought me here from our homeland, Kenra, where I was to be placed as an agent to serve the interests of Kenra should Mondstadt ever cross their warpath." Kaia waited in agony for Diluc's response. As the pieces started to click together in Diluc's mind, Kaia could see the flames of indignation raging in his eyes. "You? How could you? After all these years, you lied to us, tricked us. Father died believing in you, yet here you stand, telling me that his trust was misguided. How could you do that to him? To me?" Kaia said nothing, for not even he knew the answer to Diluc's questions. The silence only served to fuel his brother's anger more. "Father loved you like a son. He did everything he could for you like you were his own. Yet you just used him for your own nefarious purposes. He gave his life to protect Mondstadt, and you're telling me that you've been planning its downfall since you arrived? You disgrace his legacy. Did you even care for him? Did you rejoice when you saw the life leave him?" Frustration filled Kaia, and he clenched his fists as he shook his head. "Of course I didn't. I tried to get there in time, but I couldn't. If that's true, then I need to hear one thing from you. Tell me that you've forsaken the duty that you came here for. Tell me that your heart lies with Mondstadt, and only Mondstadt." Thunder rumbled in the sky, and the rain fell heavier than before. "I can't do that." "Why not?" Because I don't know," Kaia sighed, his eyes falling back to the ground. There was weakness in his voice as he reiterated, "I don't know." "I don't know either, Kaia, but if there is one thing I do know, it's that I have a duty to uphold. Not only as a knight, but as my father's son." Drawing his blade, Diluc pointed it at Kaeya, his eyes steeled with absolute resolve. I must protect Mondstadt from those that mean to do her harm, and if that means cutting you down, then so be it. Ever since he stepped foot in Mondstadt, his life was a lie, and this was the punishment he would have to face. If there was anybody that should have the honor of cutting down his web of deceit, it was Diluc. But Kaeya wouldn't go down without a fight. In Kaeya's eyes, it would be an insult to Diluc. Drawing his own sword, Kaeya faced the one he called brother. There was no enjoyment in his eyes like usual, only acceptance. For years he had served as the tinder to Diluc's burning resolve, and in doing so, he had neglected his own. What did he truly fight for? Was it his own will? Or was it someone else's that was pushed onto him? Did he still have a choice? As he and Diluc stared each other down, the memory of Master Crepus' death flashed across Kaeya's eyes. When it happened, he truly didn't know how to feel. Not only because of his conflicting allegiances, but because it was such a foreign act to him. A father who would give his life to protect his son. But now, he was starting to understand. There was no greater honor than protecting that which you love the most. That was his answer. As he came to his conclusion, a freezing chill surged through Kaeya, reaching down to the deepest recesses of his heart. It was as if he was being encased in ice, yet his body didn't slow down. Power swelled inside him, begging to be let loose, and it was almost too painful for him to bear. When Diluc's blade brought forth flames, Kaeya knew it was time. The brothers raised their swords to defend their resolve and ideals, and as the two clashed, the power inside Kaeya burst free. Raging fire was met with bitter ice, and as the two opposites met, a violent reaction blew them away from each other. Kaeya was flung back into the mud, landing square on his back, all the air forced out of his lungs. Struggling to catch his breath, Kaeya pushed himself off the ground. He could barely keep his eyes open, exhaustion setting in after releasing so much power. He saw Diluc not too far away, looking just as battered as he was. As their gazes met once again, Diluc's eyes were filled with shock. Yet nobody was more surprised at what happened than Kaeya. Breaking eye contact with Diluc, Kaeya glanced down at his lap. The light blue vision that was now in his possession glittered in the ever-falling rain. Gently grasping the heavenly gift in his hand, Kaeya could almost feel the freezing heartbeat radiating from the orb, imbuing him with its icy power. A child of the land shadowed from the eyes of the gods being recognized by the Anemoarchon himself. Kaeya could almost laugh at the irony. Looking back up at Diluc, Kaeya could see many thoughts flash across his eyes, fighting against one another. The hatred and anger had faded, only to be replaced by confusion and obstinacy. Pursing his lips, Diluc stood up, and sheathed his sword. Turning his back on Kaeya, the last thing Diluc said before retreating back into his home was, "Leave. And don't come back." Kaeya still sat in the mud as he watched the door to Diluc's home slam shut. He continued to stare at the door for a few minutes more before finally standing up. Glancing down at the vision again, Kaeya gripped it tight, a mix of determination and frustration in his eyes. Loss and gain. They always seemed to happen at the same time. But what did it all mean? Kaeya racked his brain for answers, but none would come to him. He was an agent of the enemy. Why would the Anemoarchon grant him his blessing? What did he do to deserve this? Those questions continued to clutter his mind as he departed from the winery, and headed back to Mondstadt proper. There was only one conclusion that Kaeya could come to. He had always stayed in Diluc's shadow, yet tonight, he didn't stand as Diluc's brother and confidant. He stood as Kaeya. The Kaeya that wasn't just true to his brother, but the one that was true to himself. Mondstadt was his home now, and the people were his own. They would never abandon him, or use him for an ancient plot that he no longer wanted anything to do with. Loyalty to blood be damned. It was time that he made his own mark, chose his own path, but no matter what path he forged, it would be marred by lies. If Diluc, the one that he trusted the most, acted in such a way to the truth, there was no way that Kaeya could reveal it to others. It was for the best that he bore that burden alone. If he denied his past, broke free from it, then why should others worry about it? As he accepted the hand that he had been dealt, Kaeya would always carry one thought with him. He lived in the City of Freedom, yet he knew no matter how hard he tried, he could never be free from the curse of his birthright. All that was left of Kenria were the sinners, and he was the sinner that stood above them all.